soldering tutorial. These are the things that we use for soldering. First we'll begin with the soldering iron. Soldering irons come in all different shapes and sizes. Sometimes you'll see them shaped as a gun. Sometimes it's a soldering pencil. This particular one is a soldering station, which has the soldering iron itself and a temperature control. You'll notice that on this particular station there is a sponge. The sponge is used to clean the solder tip between each soldering process. So generally what we do is we take this, wet it, squeeze the excess water out so it's not dripping wet, and then it's used in a motion like this to clean the tip, to keep it shiny. Now this tip can reach a temperature of about 650 degrees, so you must be very careful not to touch that or touch it against the cord or anything else that might burn. And so normally it's kept, when not in use, in the holder. Of course, most important with the process is solder. The solder that's used in electronics has a ratio or combination of lead. It's 60% tin and 40% lead, or sometimes in specialized soldering it's used 63-37, which would be the percentage of tin and lead. This particular one is 60-40. Also used is solder wick. Now solder wick is a braided copper wire, very fine wires, which has a lot of surface area, and what it actually does is wicks up the excess solder. So you can use this to correct any mistakes you might have made, or to remove components that have already been soldered in. So the wick will wick up the solder, and then the component can be removed. Also used at times is something called solder flux or solder paste. And the solder is just simply a paste that's used to aid in soldering. Now what the solder paste does is it removes the it removes the oxidation from the joints and anything that, any kind of excess materials that keep you from getting a good solder joint. So that assists you in this. Also, solder that's used in electronics has the same rosin core as in this flux. So in this is the core made out of the flux. You will also be using some type of cutting tool in order to cut the solder and to trim the leads from the various components that you'll be soldering onto the board. All right, once the soldering station has been turned on for a few minutes, then it's time to check to see if the tip has reached temperature hot enough to melt the solder. So first we'll clean the tip, and then we will take some of the solder and apply it to the tip to see if it's melting. So as you can see, there is a little puff of smoke, and that's not actually from the solder itself, but from the solder flux which is inside. So this tip is now hot enough because it's melting the solder, and you can see the solder is now on the tip itself. Okay, next we're going to demonstrate how to make a successful solder joint. And so what we have is a component which has been placed on the back side of this board with the legs sticking through, and you can see that these are the pads that will be soldered. And so the whole idea is to have a nice clean solder joint between the pad and the component lead. So the first thing we'll do is check our soldering tip to make sure it's clean, and we rub that against the sponge, make sure we have a nice shiny surface, and then apply a little solder. This you must do at each step. Always clean and prime the tip with a little extra solder. So now we're ready to actually do the soldering itself. So place the soldering iron so that it touches the pad and the component leg at the same time. So what we're doing is heating both, and then after a few seconds introduce a little bit of solder into the joint, and as it melts you'll see that it makes a nice shiny surface. And now we've completed the solder joint. It only takes a few seconds. And you can see that the solder has flowed across the pad and up the component leg, and so we've made a successful solder joint. The solder does not have to fill the entire pad. but it does have to be large enough so that you don't end up with a cold solder joint. One of the problems technicians have is when they're soldering, they concentrate on the job they're doing, and sometimes they forget to look around and watch what's actually happening. And this soldering iron is very, very hot, and so if I'm watching the solder that I've just done and watching it cool and make sure it's proper, I go to put my soldering iron back up.
Now, what were you saying about drinking the alcohol?
Okay, between each solder joint, then most solder technicians take a swig of the alcohol before they continue to the next solder joint.
That's the
After
important part.
doing several hundred solder joints, you really don't care what they look like, but you feel really good.
Okay.
How was it?
That was perfect, I think.
Tried to, embrace the reaction.
Oh, yeah,
somebody might have.
Yeah, you were in the moment. That was
That's the Academy Award right there, my friend. It's maybe a Golden Globe, maybe.
Hooray.